Hello everybody. When was the last time you saw a Jaguar S-Type? Once upon a time they were actually a pretty common thing on the roads of Britain, but in the last sort of half-decade they have vanished at an alarming rate. Almost certainly due in part to the fact that they seem to be suffering rather badly from rust issues. And I don't think there are that many people out there who consider these something worth spending a lot of money on and preserving. My father had an S-Type when they were a fairly new thing, about 20 years ago, and that I believe is the last time that I rode in one. So when Alex got in touch and offered me his car for review, I leapt at the chance, and I leapt at it for a few reasons. First off, I tend to enjoy driving nearly any Jaguar. Perhaps it's just a sense of patriotism in me, or maybe I just really like how they do things. In spite of the fact that I've never owned one, I do spend a lot of time browsing through the classifieds, wondering whether maybe I should. He also is another example of a young car enthusiast buying something rather unexpected. He picked this car up when he was only 21, and he's a couple years older now, but even he admits that this really is the kind of car you'd typically associate with somebody whose other car is the bus. The final reason was because this is not the standard S-Type, this is the S-Type R. Now for those who are unfamiliar, the S-Type was introduced right at the tail end of the 1990s, and it seemed to ride a wave of some sort of faux nostalgia in styling departments across Britain. Came out pretty much alongside the Rover 45, which did a very similar thing. The S-Type name had been on a Jaguar from many moons before, in the 1960s, and this was a pretty important car for the brand. It was one of the first models introduced under Ford ownership, and unlike the XKR of the time, which was a rehashed XJS, it was actually a mostly new product. The platform was shared with the Ford Thunderbird, I think. However, we never got that car here, so nobody really noticed. Your base cars had a selection of V6s. There was never a four-cylinder in the front of an S-Type. You could have a diesel, there was a petrol, and you could also get a petrol V8 at launch. In 2002, Jaguar introduced the R, and up front you will find a 4.2-litre supercharged Jaguar V8 making 400 horsepower. Put your foot down though, and from in here you wouldn't really know. What you'd think you had up there was an enormous supercharger and nothing else, because from inside the cockpit all you get is that supercharger whine. Now some people might like that, I actually kind of enjoy it, but a lot didn't. In fact, when this car came out, each one of the Top Gear trio, Clarkson, Hammond and May, said very, very unkind things about the S-Type. Through the lens of 2020, it's a bit of an odd car really. There are certainly things in here which date it. The Ford-tastic centre console here, which actually isn't terrible, and it's nearly acceptable in a car which wasn't super high-end. The dials actually are pretty nice, and other than the very basic graphics on them, I think they're pretty decent, fairly timeless. The interior feels perhaps a step up from, say, a BMW 3 Series of the period, maybe not in terms of its buttons, which are very clearly Ford, but in terms of the materials. It all does seem like Jaguar are trying to make a little bit more effort. A lot of S-Types had a very sort of old-school interior, plenty of wood and everything going on. The R has this sexier diamond-looking affair, and actually, it's not a bad place to be. These seats are pretty comfortable too, and actually, I think the overall looks of the car have aged all right. It's not a great-looking car, but I don't think it's a bad-looking one either. The headlights do look a touch on the cheap side, but the body kit, which is fairly subtle and came as standard with the R, I think does lift it, gives it a touch more aggression. It's certainly practical enough too. There is plenty of space in here for 4 adults, even if it isn't the roomiest in the back, and the boots are pretty darn good size too. Not the deepest, but it's fairly long and wide, so you can fit pretty much whatever you need in there. I'm quite confident that the obligatory industry standard golf clubs would get in there no problem. The first question I suppose a lot of people would have is, why on earth would a 21-year-old want a Jaguar S-Type? Well, the answer is mostly at the front. Alex will admit that he is a young man with an old soul, because this is the kind of car that appeals to him. He previously had a 1.2 litre Z-Tech Fiesta, the 6th generation car, I believe, and he leapt straight into this from that. I have to applaud the man, I really do, because that is a hell of a leap, and this car is very much a credit to him. It's actually in pretty good nick. A lot of S-Types out there are not. If you want to buy yourself one of these, prices of the R seem to start at around the £5,000 mark, but I'm not sure how good those cars would be. They seem to top out around about double that, and that's actually reasonable value, I think. If you look at, say, an M3 of the time, 10 grand is only going to get you into the ropey end of the market. Of course, this is a very different car to drive in comparison to the M3. There's still a little bit of firmness to the suspension. You can tell that this was damped with comfort as a secondary concern, and they knew that they wanted to make this a more performance-orientated car. That being said, though, it's not crashy or disturbing or anything of the sort, and if you're used to a modern hot hatch, actually you'd still say this is a pretty plush ride. It rides far better than my BMW 130i, as an example. The sole gearbox option in the R was a 6-speed automatic, which is operated here through a very old-school J-gate system. Notably, this car actually got the 6-speed before the XK, which was still stuck with the 5 at the time. Being a supercharged lump, throttle response is instant, and for bimbling around town, it's actually a very good car. Doesn't feel too big, visibility is very good, the steering wheel is lovely, you've got the stitching, you've got the angry Jaguar staring right at you, you've got some basic controls for the stereo, not so keen on the chrome door handles, and one of the oddest things when I was doing my static shots of the car, the reflectors on the side, very odd and very distracting, especially on a dark coloured car. They look almost like a sort of US spec thing, although they're not in US spec colours. Perhaps that was Jag just trying to save a little bit of cash in the design department. For many people, a Jaguar will be very much a car associated with the pipe and slippers mob. However, to those same pipe and slippers people, the reason they were probably into Jags is because when they were young men, this was the choice of the hooligan. The Jaguar was the car that you buy if you were a sleazy football player. You were the kind of man that needed a 4-seater because that was how many women you took home at the weekend. Or alternatively, that was how many people you need to pull off that job you were going to do next week. Jaguars, once upon a time, were very much a bad boy's car. So, how does this one perform on my favourite test road? Let's find out. I must say, it rather feels like this car was made for this road. There isn't an awful lot of noise or bluster, save for that supercharger whine, but it just gets on with the job. The steering is direct enough, it's not particularly feelsome, and the gearbox is a definite frustration. You can try operating it with the J-gate system if you like, but it doesn't really seem to achieve all that much. In sport mode, it'll want to alternate between either being in the tallest gear it can find or the shortest. But thankfully, that engine is pretty flexible, so it being in the wrong gear more often than not isn't as much of a problem as you might think. Pulls pretty strongly from about 2,000 RPM onwards and will run all the way to a fairly lowly 6,000 RPM redline. Not a slow car though, and the damping is absolutely marvellous. There is a little bit of pitch and roll to the body, but just enough to keep you comfortable, but also keep the car in check. Feels closer to some of the old school performance cars I've driven down here, stuff like the old Merc C43, that sort of thing. In fact, at this kind of pace, which is pretty much national speed limit, it's sublimely comfortable. It's really remarkable. I've spent the last couple of weeks driving some incredibly well-damped cars, including some with some real suspension trickery, the active dampers on the Audi S8 and so on and so forth, and this is right up there with them. Pretty impressive too, because this was not really an especially lightweight car, clocking in at over 1,800 kilos. The 0 to 60 dash of just over 5 seconds gives you an idea that the performance of this car was brisk, not incredible. But trust me, it's fast enough to have fun in, and as a 23-year-old, this is a serious car to have. If you want to modify these things, it can be done, and indeed at some point I do hope to drive a modified example. But as standard, I don't really have too many complaints about the car. Also, it being standard means that insurance isn't entirely unreasonable, and believe it or not, Alex pays about 500 quid for this. In fact, he pays less to insure this now than he did on his Fiesta not too long before. If something like an M3 appeals to you, this is definitely not the right car. The Jaguar is a very refined car overall. I'm actually also quite surprised at how few creaks and squeaks and rattles there are in here. It's pretty good. There's one really minor one in the door, and that's about it. You'd think with a car like this that it would be the engine which dominates proceedings, but actually that's not the case at all. This is more a sort of maintaining speed car. The engine gets you up to pace and then you just stay there. You weren't looking, were you? The engine is very good at getting you up to the speed that you would like, and then you use that supreme damping to just maintain that speed regardless of what the road is doing. Brakes are decent too, if not spectacular. In the 2 years Alex has owned this car, he hasn't done all that many miles. In fact, the odometer is reading just shy of 97,000, up from 91k when he got it. But it has at least been pretty reliable in that time. In fact, nothing has gone wrong. I'm not going to promise that that would always be the case if you went and bought an old S-Type, but I'm glad to say it's true for at least one person. I've also been relatively impressed today with the amount of traction that the car has been able to find. It's got pretty big rear boots, 275 wide, but it doesn't have a limited slip differential. Some of its siblings I found to be somewhat wayward when you're trying to make progress on a day such as today, but actually as long as you're reasonably careful with your throttle, there's no need to be afraid of the S-Type. It's never going to be a drift machine, or at least not easily anyway, but that really isn't the kind of image that this car exudes. And you can find the limit of grip at the front if you go looking for it, just a little bit of adjustment through the corner, and then she just goes. But honestly, this isn't a car that eggs you on at all. You just find a speed with it, and that's it. It's happy. It doesn't push you. It's actually quite a relaxing car to drive quickly. It is, therefore, I think, a proper Jag. The S-Type, I've no doubt, will always have its detractors, and I think I'd say I'm just about as unkeen on a basic 2.7 diesel as anybody else would be. However, when it comes to these, you can count me as an S-Type fan. So, that's all from me. Thanks to you for watching. Thanks to Alex for bringing the car out. Please like, comment below, subscribe if you haven't already, and I shall see you all for the next one. Bye-bye.